For the most part, Splatoon is a very skill-based game. In fact, you have to look really far to find a few things that are actually determined by random chance, but there's one thing that sticks out more than anything else in the game. Shot RNG, or weapon spread, or whatever you want to call it. Basically, the chance for your bullets to go not where you're aiming and go somewhere else. Some weapons only have these in the air, some weapons have them in both, and some don't have it whatsoever. On my Twitter, I frequently do polls on the game, and one I did that got a lot more attention than I thought is what are your thoughts on shot RNG in Splatoon 2? This ended up getting 2,000 votes, and while the poll results look like this, there was actually a lot more discussion in the comments. So I'm gonna go over what you guys have to say and then talk about it, and if this is even an issue that needs to be solved, and what they should do. So if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe for more, and let's get right into it. So let's go over the most extreme opinion right off the bat, and I think Vesper probably says it best. IMO, RNG that brings high risk reward has no place in a competitive shooter. Some amount of spread is okay, but the 96 gal can be the best weapon in the game one match and the worst the next. That ain't cool. This was a sentiment shared by a surprising number of people, and in the poll, 11% of you guys felt like RNG as a mechanic should not exist whatsoever, and every single weapon in the game should be fully accurate. I think this is one of those things where, in a perfect world, it seems like this would be a reasonable decision. If things could be balanced to not have any form of RNG whatsoever, that would make the most sense. And there are some really extreme examples, 96 probably being the most notable one. While some things like Range Blaster have a ridiculous amount of RNG compared to their firing output, at least they're accurate on the ground. 96 has ridiculous RNG pretty much all the time outside of when you just start shooting. And even that is not fully reliable. At the very least, I think it would be simpler to tone down RNG as a mechanic and make it weaker even if you can't remove it altogether. And while I'll talk about this a bit more later, I don't really see any reason why you wouldn't try to minimize how much of an effect RNG has on the game. Another sentiment shared by a lot of the people with this opinion is that RNG in most games just shouldn't be a way to balance it. I feel like weapons like 52 gal or other strong weapons don't need to be balanced by luck, rather other things like fire rate and range. And yeah, I think if RNG is the main way you balance a weapon, you've probably done a pretty poor job. Moving to the option most people agreed with, and easily the most popular in the poll, is that some weapons need less or no RNG, but not all of them. A lot of notable people weighed in on this, so I'm gonna try to go through the responses as fast as possible, including Ren saying that skill shot weapons should generally have little to no shot deviation. Exceptions could be made on the far ends of the spectrum, like a hyper-accurate shooter with a high time to kill, or vice versa. In other words, you wouldn't give chargers shot deviation, so why the f does range have it? Soldier saying if shooters are going to get and keep all these frame data buffs, then it's only fair the majority of non-shooters get their RNG improved or downright removed, for jump RNG shots at least. Sendu shares this sentiment with none for blasters, more for shooters. A sentiment other notable players agreed on, such as Scar, and FLC, who specifically wants to note that I think we're running into major issues at the top end where non-shooter weapons are too slow and get traded too easily. Blasters should be getting their jump accuracy back for sure, a sentiment Kyo agrees with. And to wrap up these statements, Ollie says shot RNG, in theory, is a neat trade-off between turf and time to kill, and is fitting for some weapons, but it's a necessary element of so many others. Why do blasters, the class that focus on slaying, have to keep their feet painted for everything? Among all these high-level competitive players and coaches is a very common sentiment, which is that shooters are far too good right now with their mobility and don't really need less RNG, while most slower weapons, especially blasters, really have no reason to have this much RNG in the first place and could do without them. And in many ways, this is the side I tend to find myself on. I think it's really hard to reduce RNG on shooters with how good they already are, and for a lot of slower weapons, it feels weird that they have this much to begin with. I think it's a lot easier to picture the effects on this on a weapon that already doesn't have jump RNG, something like the Explosher. Can you imagine if this weapon had to keep its feet constantly planted to function? Look how slow this is. Jumping on things like shooters isn't actually that useful because they're so mobile when they remain grounded, but for slower weapons, once you get to a certain speed, you're just absolutely dependent on jumping because anything otherwise is just asking to die. RNG and mobility can correlate here, and there's a lot more to talk about I'll have to say when I go through my own opinion at the end, particularly with Splatoon 3's movement options, but for now I want to move on to the final part of this argument, which is that it doesn't need any changes whatsoever. While there were poll responses for it, I couldn't find a tweet saying that all weapons should have RNG. There were definitely a few replies that stated that it was overall a solid mechanic, but none that agreed that every single weapon should have it, and definitely talked about exceptions like rollers or blasters that didn't need it. Alright, so that's everything you guys mentioned about the topic, but what do I think think about RNG? Well, I think it's a bit more complicated. Before we could even get into if it's a necessary mechanic in the first place, getting rid of it entirely proposes a ton of balance problems, mainly in differentiating a ton of the shooters. Sure, things like 52 and Splattershot have more things to set it apart besides shot RNG, but it's definitely one of the main factors. Another thing to note is how much faster the game is getting. A lot of weapons in this game, not even just shooters, got end-lag buffs. We are moving to a more and more fast-paced game, and as Splatoon 3 comes out, we are introducing 2 new movement options that you can use, especially for slower weapons, to have better mobility. Which, while in one way, yes, this seems like a direct answer to the mobility issues that are presented by shooters, on another, it's just continuing to make this game faster, and if slow weapons can't take full advantage of these movement options, they are going to continue to fall behind. I'm not saying this is a bad direction for the game. In fact, I think it's a positive one. Splatoon is a fast-paced game, and making it faster is fair, especially when adding more depth to it like these movement options provide, and going back and taking away a bunch of end-lag buffs to make everything feel slower would not be an enjoyable experience. Personally, I think some other classes though, like blasters and rollers, very clearly do not have any use for it since they aren't painting weapons and are generally slayers or skill shot ones. And because they're more simple in their role compared to shooters that can do a lot of different things, I think it's a lot easier to balance around the idea of getting rid of their shot RNG. And even if we don't want to go on the path of getting rid of that RNG completely, I see no reason to at the very least reduce it to make it more reliable. However, once we bring up the inevitability of shooters, there's a few interesting things to note. One, shooters generally have better accuracy when they start shooting, and that's something that resets. Even things like 52 and 96 with a lot of RNG abide by this, making it much more controllable than things like Blaster's jump RNG. The other attribute worth noting is sometimes this shot RNG is actually a positive, mainly in terms of painting. Being able to shoot in different areas can help for a wider paint spread, and for weapons like Junior and Aerospray, this means they have very good close combat painting capabilities, which is useful in some situations. It's definitely possible to make this a more controlled factor, but the bottom line is you would want them to have some form of spread. It actually positively benefits them to be able to be inaccurate. That being said, even here I think there are some examples that go too far, mainly 96, and for weapons with this absurd amount of RNG, I would not be opposed to it being reduced, even for a weapon class like shooters. The final thing I want to say is, yes, in a perfect world, I think getting rid of RNG isn't exactly unreasonable, and I can't think of any major reasons why it being completely gone would be a bad thing, again, in this perfect world situation where everything can still be balanced. And for the record, I do think you can balance this game very well, even if every single weapon in the game has perfect accuracy. That being said, it requires a lot of time and effort, and is it really that necessary? Yes, there are some weapons like blasters that absolutely need less RNG, but there are other weapons like shooters that can get around it and in some cases actually benefit. On the road to a perfect Splatoon game, I think shot RNG will eventually be removed, but for right now, outside of a few exceptions, it's a tiny problem barely hurting the class already at the top, and there's just so many other things worth looking at first, such as the specials or maps that it looks like they're dealing with. And there are other ways to get around this game balance problem and RNG issues, such as the movement options I mentioned previously or changing the specific weapon classes. I don't think an RNG overhaul is entirely necessary. Again, would it be nice at some point? Sure, but I think this is a problem for a more future Splatoon game, or maybe at best later in Splatoon 3's lifespan, not something that needs an immediate solution. So one day I think we'll be enjoying a Splatoon game without any shot RNG, but for now I think just reducing it and paying attention to other problems that will indirectly help this one is the best course of action. With that being said though, RNG is a very complicated topic, and I'm curious to hear what you guys think in the comments. Thank you so much for watching.